The shuttle broke through the cloud layer at an angle that suggested the autopilot had opinions about dramatics, and Elias Vance got his first real look at Vel'Shari Prime through a viewport the size of a dinner plate, which felt like an intentional insult given the scale of what was outside it. The planet did not look destroyed. That was the first thing that surprised him. It looked wounded, which was different. The way a face looks different after something has gone out of it that used to be there. The ocean shelves visible from descent were the color of old pewter where they should have been deep blue-green, and the atmospheric haze sitting over the northern continent carried a brownish tint that his transit briefing documents had described, with the careful neutrality of people who had written too many briefing documents, as indicative of ongoing particulate instability. Elias had read that phrase 3 times on the journey, and each time it had meant the same thing. The sky is still deciding what it wants to be. He had been doing this for 11 years. Before Vel'Shari Prime, there had been a flood crisis on a water world in the Marin system. Before that, a slow agricultural collapse on a colony station, whose hydroponics AI had developed what the engineers called a calibration error, and what the colonists called a personality. He had learned, across 11 years and more emergency deployments than his contract file could list without a scroll function, that disasters had textures. Some were loud and fast, and required a different kind of person than he was. The ones he was sent to were the slow kind. The ones that had been building for decades before they became a headline. The ones where the actual work was not heroic and did not photograph well and involved a great deal of spreadsheets. His tablet chimed. 43 new resource allocation requests had arrived during descent, which meant someone on the ground had found out he was landing and had decided that the appropriate welcome was paperwork. He appreciated the honesty of it. The landing platform was enormous and nearly empty, which gave the single figure waiting at its center a quality that Elias recognized from diplomatic contexts: the deliberate staging of importance through negative space. The figure was tall, pale violet, faintly luminescent along the jaw, and holding a data slate with the focused grip of someone who had been holding it for a while and was prepared to hold it indefinitely. When Elias stepped off the ramp, the figure inclined their head at a precise angle that the protocol document, 412 pages, the summary transmission had noted helpfully, with key sections in red, would probably have a name for. Coordinator Vance, the figure said, in standard that carried no accent because it had been learned from a program rather than a person. I am Thessaly, assigned as your court liaison. The empress will receive you at the 3rd hour of the High Court session. I have transmitted the formal protocol document to your tablet. The most critical sections are marked. How many critical sections? Thessaly considered this. 47. Elias looked at the amber sky, where 2 moons were doing something geometrically improbable in the mid-afternoon. He looked back at Thessaly, whose jaw had brightened slightly in the interval, producing the gentle glow of someone experiencing a feeling they had been trained not to name. He had met a lot of court liaisons. He had learned that the ones who glowed were the honest ones. "Is there coffee on this planet?" he said, "or is that also in the document?" Thessaly's jaw flickered. "There is a beverage derived from a seed native to the western continent that the translation matrix renders as coffee. Its relationship to what you may be accustomed to is approximate." "Approximate is fine," Elias said. "Approximate is most of what I work with." They moved through corridors that had been built to make visitors understand something about the civilization that built them. Ceilings that climbed beyond practical necessity. Walls inlaid with materials that shifted color in the peripheral vision. Floors that rang faintly underfoot with a resonance that was probably ceremonial and definitely unsettling, until you stopped noticing it. Elias noticed it for about 4 minutes, and then his tablet chimed again and he stopped noticing it. The empress received him in the primary audience chamber at precisely the 3rd hour, which told him something. Punctuality in a crisis was not a courtesy. It was information. She was younger than he had expected, which he immediately noted as a failure of expectation rather than a fact about her, because she stood with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to let room see them think. Her skin was the pale silver gray of deep water, and her eyes held a bioluminescent quality, not glowing exactly, but lit from somewhere interior, the way certain deep ocean creatures are lit, as though the light was a byproduct of pressure rather than a performance of it. The ceremony happened. The formal words were spoken. The court officials filed and arranged themselves with the choreographic precision of people who had done this many times with many different dignitaries, and had long since stopped wondering what the dignitaries were actually thinking. What Elias was actually thinking was that the resource allocation backlog on his tablet had reached 61 items, and that one of them was flagged in a color, the system reserved for situations involving structural failure. Then the court officials began to move toward the next scheduled event, and the empress turned and looked at him with an expression that had nothing to do with ceremony. "Show me," she said, "where you would start." Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his tablet, pulled up the map he had sketched on the transit shuttle, and started talking. The first thing Elias learned about the Vel'Shari bureaucratic system was that it had 17 distinct categories for the word urgent, arranged in a hierarchy of escalating desperation that culminated in a classification his translation software rendered as cosmically non-deferrable, which appeared on exactly 4 of the 942 items waiting for him on his first full working day, and which he decided, after brief consideration, to treat the same way he treated all urgent things. In order, without panic, with coffee that was approximately what coffee was supposed to be. The second thing he learned was that the noble houses of Vel'Shari Prime had been conducting a territorial water rights dispute for 640 years, and that this dispute had not been paused by the ecological collapse so much as it had been incorporated into it, the way a river incorporates an obstacle flowing around it, wearing at it, never quite acknowledging that the obstacle and the river were now, functionally, the same problem. He spent 11 days on the water rights question alone. At the end of those 11 days, he had produced a resource-sharing framework that 3 of the 4 houses had provisionally agreed to, and the 4th had rejected on the grounds that the document had been formatted in a typeface historically associated with a rival house, which Thessaly relayed to him with the expression of someone delivering information they had personally decided not to have feelings about. Elias had looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Change the typeface," he said. "It may not be entirely about the typeface," Thessaly said. "I know, change it anyway. Give them something small to win so we can move past it." Thessaly's jaw glowed with what Elias had begun to identify as the specific frequency of reluctant admiration. The 4th house signed 3 days later. The work was relentless in the way that meaningful work is relentless, not punishing, but total. It asked for everything and did not apologize for asking. Elias gave it everything and did not apologize for that either. He rebuilt the supply chain routing for the northern continent's atmospheric filtration network across 2 weeks of 18-hour sessions in a coordination room that the palace had assigned him and which contained, for reasons that remained cosmologically unclear, a portrait of someone's ancestor staring down at the logistics table with an expression of distinguished skepticism. Elias had eventually begun addressing the portrait when he was working through a particularly resistant problem. Thessaly had walked in on this once and chosen not to mention it, which Elias respected. He had standing meetings with Saravale every 3rd day. They were scheduled for 1 hour and reliably ran to 2, because she asked questions. Not the questions of someone managing appearances, not the questions that required reassuring answers, but the specific, load-bearing questions of someone who needed to understand the structure of a thing before she would move weight onto it. She had a mind that went straight to the variable you had hoped she wouldn't notice yet, and she did this without performance, without the particular theater of intelligence that people used when they wanted you to know they were being intelligent. She simply understood things quickly and then immediately wanted to understand the thing beneath them. It unsettled his workflow initially. He had worked with heads of state before. He had worked with crisis administrators, emergency governors, provisional authorities of various compositions and levels of competence. He had developed, across those 11 years, a reliable method. Present the options, make the recommendation, execute the decision. Clean, fast, reproducible. Saravel did not fit that method because she was not interested in receiving recommendations so much as she was interested in building them alongside whoever was in the room, which meant the meetings were not briefings so much as they were. He turned the word over several times before he settled on it, conversations. He was not sure he had been having conversations at work for a very long time. The agricultural miscommunication happened in the 5th week and became, within the palace's informal social geography, something of a legend. Elias translation software, updated 2 deployments ago for a system with different agricultural vocabulary, rendered a ministry request for 12,000 units of a biological soil amendment, as a request for 12,000 ceremonial grain offerings associated with a founding-era imperial ritual that had not been performed since the 3rd dynasty. The ministry received his confirmation and was briefly, according to Thessaly's later account, in a state of profound institutional confusion. 3 hours, 2 court scholars, 1 hallway, 1 nutrition bar. Thessaly, visible through the doorway of the conference room, maintaining a steady glow that Elias could have read by. When it was resolved, he found Saravel already aware of it. The palace moved information the way all palaces moved information, which was to say immediately and with editorial additions. She said nothing about it directly. She simply looked at him across the logistics table with an expression that contained, if he was reading it correctly, something in the neighborhood of amusement, and then returned to the atmospheric projection data. He decided this was the Vel'Shari version of a joke, and responded to it as he would have responded to a joke, which was to say he moved on without comment and felt, in the moving on, that something between them had quietly shifted into a more comfortable register. By the 8th week, the first zone stabilization readings came back clean. Not healed, stable. There was a difference, and everyone in the coordination room knew the difference, but Thessaly's jaw dimmed to its softest light in 2 months, and Elias looked at the data on his tablet for a long moment before he said anything. What he said, eventually, was that they should update the projection model for the 2nd zone, and that he would need the northern supply chain report by morning. Thessaly said yes. Nobody in the room commented on the fact that nobody in the room was entirely composed. It was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary. It needed the next step, which was already waiting, and which Elias was already looking at, and which was going to take everything they had, same as the last one. He walked back to his chamber that night through corridors that had stopped feeling foreign sometime in the 5th week without his having noticed the exact moment of transition. The fountain was running. He did not find it strange anymore. The announcement came on a Tuesday, which was not a concept Vel'Shari Prime had until Elias arrived and began marking his calendar in terms his nervous system could process, and which the palace staff had adopted with the cheerful adaptability of people who had decided that if the human needed to call the 4th day of the administrative cycle a Tuesday, then Tuesdays were simply what those days were now. It was posted to the official court register, transmitted across the Empire's communication network, and delivered to Elias' tablet between a revised water table projection for the southern zone and a request from the 3rd Noble House, asking whether the soil amendment program could be rebranded to not share a name with a historical land tax. The ceremony would take place in 23 days. The Grand Hall was already being prepared. His replacement had been identified, and the handover briefing was scheduled for the following week. He read it twice. Then he opened the water table projection, because the water table projection was something he could do something about. The replacement's name was Administrator Corval, and she was extraordinarily competent in the way that made Elias feel simultaneously relieved and unnecessary, which he recognized as the correct way to feel, and which did not make it more comfortable. He spent 4 days briefing her across systems he had built and rebuilt and modified under pressure, until they no longer resembled the original design documents, explaining not just what each component did, but why it did it that way, which decisions had been made for reasons that were still valid, and which had been made at 3 in the morning under conditions that had seemed logical at the time. Corval asked precise questions and took comprehensive notes, and at one point looked at the atmospheric filtration rerouting framework with an expression that suggested she was deciding whether to say something, and then said it, which was that the redundancy structure in the Eastern relay chain was technically inefficient. Elias agreed that it was. He had built it inefficient on purpose, because the Eastern relay chain served a population zone that had already lost infrastructure twice and did not need a system optimized for normal conditions. Corval was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notes. He decided she was going to be fine. Thessaly was not managing the approaching date with the same composure. The jaw had settled into a frequency that Elias now understood as sustained, low-grade emotional processing, the bioluminescent equivalent of a person doing something with their hands to avoid doing something with their face. Thessaly was also scheduling things, an unusual number of things, filling the final weeks with briefings and coordination reviews, and one administrative walkthrough of the southern supply routes that was so transparently an excuse to spend 3 hours in professional proximity that Elias completed it without comment and afterward stood with Thessaly in a field of recovering grassland, watching the atmospheric sensors report particulate levels that were, for the first time in recorded crisis period data, unremarkable, and said nothing, because some things did not require saying. The farewell dinner was not officially a farewell dinner. It was listed in Thessaly's schedule as a coordination debrief, which violated the definition of coordination debrief in ways that became immediately apparent when Elias arrived to find 14 members of the palace working staff arranged around a table that held food, drinks, and no coordination documents whatsoever. There was a banner. It had been made by hand, which on Vel'Shari Prime was a significant gesture, and it read in imperfect standard that suggested a translation committee had been involved, to the one who fixed the typeface problem and also the planet. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who had not been expected by his own emotions and was negotiating a diplomatic arrangement with them on short notice. The stories came out over the course of 2 hours with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting to tell them. The night the northern relay station lost power, and Elias had rerouted the entire eastern supply chain through a secondary system designed for half the load, which should not have worked and had worked for 11 days while repairs were completed. The water rights negotiation in which one noble house representative had walked out, and Elias had followed them into the corridor, and had a conversation that lasted 4 minutes, and that nobody had been able to fully reconstruct from the available evidence, but that had resulted in the representative returning to the table. The time his translation software had rendered a standard logistics confirmation as what the receiving ministry understood to be a formal imperial declaration of soup. Elias ate something that tasted approximately like a dumpling and laughed at the soup story with the others, and the laughing was genuine, and also, he was aware, performing a function that was not entirely about the soup story. Thessaly's jaw was at its softest setting all evening. He did not look at that too directly. Saravale was not there. He had not expected her to be. Their relationship lived in the space between ceremony and function, and a staff dinner in a small room fell outside both categories, and he understood why her absence was correct and appropriate, and said nothing about how the room was slightly different in shape without her in it. He walked back through the palace corridors at the end of the evening, with the particular fullness of someone who had received something they had not known they needed, and were now uncertain what to do with it. The night before the ceremony, he stood at the window of his chamber for a long time. The sky was lighter, not healed. He had learned to be precise about that distinction, because precision mattered more in recovery than in disaster, because recovery was where the real work was, and where the real work could be undone by carelessness. But lighter. The amber had shifted towards something that was beginning to be gold in certain hours of the afternoon, and the particulate readings from the northern monitoring stations had been in the unremarkable range for 9 consecutive days, and the refugee population figures had been moving in their correct direction for 2 months. He had done what he had been sent to do. His tablet was packed. The briefing documents for the flooded moon colony were downloaded and waiting. He stood at the window and thought about those things carefully and in sequence. The fountain ran behind him. He did not turn around. The morning of the ceremony, Elias' tablet chimed at 6 with a message from the consortium confirming his departure transit window, and then again at 6:03 with the updated briefing package for the flooded moon colony, and then at 6:07 with a note from Thessaly reminding him that the formal attire selected for the ceremony was hanging in the left alcove of his chamber, and should not. The note emphasized with a specificity that suggested prior experience with him, be confused with the dust cover on the atmospheric sensor equipment he had been calibrating the previous afternoon. He had not been going to confuse them. He was fairly certain he had not been going to confuse them. He dressed with the methodical attention of a man completing a task, because that was what it was, and because treating it as anything else would require him to think about what it was a task within, which was a larger question he had been deferring with great professional discipline for approximately 3 weeks. The formal attire fit correctly. Thessaly had accounted for everything, which was, he thought, a summary of Thessaly as a person, and he stood for a moment in the chamber that had been the size of a sports arena and now simply felt like the room he had been living in, with the fountain he had stopped hearing because it had become part of the sound of the place, and he picked up his tablet and he went. The hall was already filled when he arrived. He had read the acoustic specification in the protocol document. It had been in one of the 47 critical sections, marked in red. The note about how even soft sounds from the central platform carried to the furthest gallery without assistance, a feature of the original architectural design that the Vel'Shari had spent 4 centuries being proud of, and which Elias had retained as a technical fact in the part of his mind that stored technical facts next to other technical facts, filed inert, not yet understood as relevant. He stood on the raised platform and looked out at the assembled thousands, and the technical fact stayed where it was, filed and inert. He was thinking about transit windows. He was thinking about the flooded moon colony. He was, with the focused discipline of a man who had navigated 11 years of impossible situations, by keeping his attention exactly where it was needed, thinking about everything that was not the specific feeling of standing in this particular room about to leave it. Thessaly was in the 3rd row. The jaw was lit with a steady warmth that Elias had come to understand was not stress but something else, the bioluminescent register of someone who had made peace with a feeling without resolving it, which he recognized because he had been living in that register himself for several weeks. He met Thessaly's eyes for a moment. Thessaly inclined their head at the precise angle that the protocol document probably had a name for. Elias decided it meant something outside the document entirely. The ceremony moved through its stages with the dignity of something that had been performed for centuries and knew its own weight. Elias received each formal acknowledgement with the composure that 11 years had built into him, the professional stillness of someone who had learned to be present in rooms without being consumed by them. The Empire's official gratitude was recorded. His service was recognized in the language that ceremony used for such things, elevated, formal, correct, and about 15% adjacent to what the actual experience had been, which was not a criticism of ceremony but simply the nature of it. Ceremony preserved the shape of things. The interior was between the people who had been there. Then Saravale crossed the platform toward him, and the hall's attention moved with her the way attention always moved with her. Not because of performance, but because she was the kind of person whose movement through a space changed the quality of the air in it. And she was holding the ceremonial token, and everything was proceeding in precise accordance with protocol. And Elias' tablet was packed, and his transit window was confirmed, and Administrator Corval had the Eastern Relay Chain and the Water Rights Framework and the Atmospheric Rerouting System, and all of it was in order. Everything was in order. He had done what he had been sent to do. This was the correct ending, and he knew how correct endings felt because he had stood in them before. He had stood in a version of this moment on a water world and a colony station and 4 other places. He had done this before and knew precisely what it was. She reached him, she took his hand, and then she said, quietly enough that it should not have carried, in a register meant for the space between 2 people rather than the space of an empire, 7 words that the hall, designed in its founding stones to carry exactly this: to refuse the pretense of private speech in a public place, delivered without mercy to every corner, every gallery, every witness who had come to see a ceremony, and was now inside something that had no protocol section. I cannot rule without you, stay. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the most populated silence Elias had ever stood inside, thousands of people breathing, none of them speaking, all of them having heard, none of them knowing what category to put it in. He was aware of Thessaly in the 3rd row. He was aware of the hall's acoustics, now understood with a completeness that no briefing document could have produced. He was aware of her hand holding his, which was steady in the way she was always steady, which was not the absence of feeling but the presence of it held still through will and practice. He looked at her. She looked back with the interior light that came from pressure rather than performance, and in it he could see the thing she had not said in any of their meetings across 6 months, the thing that had sat behind every question she had asked and every silence she had let exist between them. He had been reading her for 6 months. He had been, if he was honest with himself in a way that 11 years of moving between emergencies had made difficult, deliberately not reading that particular signal, because reading it would have required him to look at the corresponding signal in himself, and he was better at logistics than cartography of that kind. The flooded moon colony was waiting. The consortium had a transit window confirmed. Administrator Corval had everything she needed. He thought about the window of his chamber and the sky that was not healed but lighter. He thought about the fountain that he had stopped hearing, because it had become part of the sound of the place